So thank you all for coming today. My name is John Carey. I'm a professor in the government department, and it's my pleasure to introduce Kevin Casas-Zamora, who's going to be our speaker this afternoon. Kevin, since 2015, has been the director of the Peter D. Bell Rule of Law program at the Inter-American Dialogue, which I think really has become Washington's premier think tank on policy in the Western Hemisphere. But he has a long history of service before that, and I'm going only to touch on some of the high points here. Kevin was Secretary General of Political Affairs at the Organization of American States from 2012 to 2015. He was a researcher and director of the Latin America Initiative at the Brookings Institution. Before that, he was Minister of Planning and Political Economy and Second Vice President of the Republic of Costa Rica during the second administration of President Oscar Arias in that country. He has taught at George Washington University, at the University of Costa Rica, at Oxford. He's been a consultant to the United Nations Development Program. He has a PhD from Oxford in political science. There's a long list. His resume is long. I will note he is really, I think, the foremost scholar of the nexus between money and politics in Latin America. He's written books and reports on state funding of political campaigns, of the sources and influence of money from organized crime in politics in Latin America, and on the economic interests of militaries and paramilitaries in Latin American politics. Most recently, Kevin has just released with his co-author Daniel Zavato a new book called The Cost of Democracy, Essays on Political Finance in Latin America, which is available from the Inter-American Dialogue. I first met Kevin 24 years ago when he was a law student at the University of Costa Rica, and I was a graduate student doing research for my PhD dissertation in that country. And one of our mutual advisors connected us because of our shared interests, and I've been following his career with great interest ever since. Last fall, I was reading yet another news account of the persistent problems of violence and physical insecurity in Central America, and I came across a reference to Kevin's testimony before the U.S. Senate's Committee on Homeland Security. And it occurred to me then to get in touch and ask Kevin if he'd be willing to come up and speak to us here at Dartmouth about that issue. And so I'm delighted to say he was available to come up. I want to thank the Dickey Center and Director Dan Benjamin for supporting this visit. And I look forward to hearing Kevin's thoughts on Central American politics once again after so many years. So please join me in welcoming Kevin Casas-Zamora.
Well, thank you very much for that very warm and kind welcome. And thank you all for being here. I would like to start by saying, how honored I am to be at Dartmouth College for the first time. I was telling John that this is the first time I made the trek north of Boston. So this is a whole new thing for me. And I would like to thank the Dickey Center, the Department of Government, and the Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Studies program for making possible my visit here. And most of all, I would like to thank Professor John Carey for this very kind invitation. As he was mentioning, it's truly wonderful to see you after all these years. 24 years is a lot. It's a lot, and I won't say you look the same. Neither do I, but it's truly phenomenal, to see you again, and likewise, I followed your career with enormous admiration, and I have to say that I've profited and benefited enormously from your writings, which count amongst the best things to come out on political regimes and electoral systems and Latin American politics. I have to thank you for that. And I would also like to say that when John suggested a topic for this talk, I was very happy that he asked me to say something about Central America. Coming from Costa Rica, it is naturally the part of the world that I care the most about, and about which I guess I know a few things. But besides this, it is a region that after being the Syria of the 1980s, pretty much dropped off the U.S. radar screen for over 20 years. Lately, it has made a kind of short-lived comeback into the headlines, mostly for the wrong reasons. Indeed, after a period of relative optimism in which the region basked in the success of putting an end to devastating civil wars and replacing authoritarian regimes, some of them of unspeakable brutality, with democratically elected governments, Central America seems to be reverting to its battle ways. 4 Central American countries, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua, are facing serious political and security problems of varying intensity. The gravity of their current plight is best captured by a grim statistic. 100,000 unaccompanied migrant children from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador have been apprehended at the U.S. southern border over the past 5 years. They are but a subset, albeit a particularly tragic one, of the approximately 3 million migrants from the so-called Northern Triangle of Central America that have reached U.S. shores over the past 2 decades, often after a harrowing journey that could belong in the pages of Dante's Inferno. Uncontrolled migration is not the only worrying sign. In 2009, we saw in Honduras a near-democratic breakdown, which in some respects was a throwback to the darkest stages of Latin American political history. Despite the election of 2 administrations since, the deep drivers of the Honduran crisis remain unresolved until today. To this, we have to add the political unraveling of Nicaragua, where since 2007 we have witnessed the demise of the democratic institutions that, with all their imperfections, were the tangible legacy of not 1, but 2 different civil wars and over 50,000 deaths. Guatemala, in turn, faces a deeper problem that goes beyond the nature of the current government to encompass the very ability of its state to exert authority over its territory. Severely challenged by organized crime, Guatemala faces an existential crucible whose result will have regional implications. Insofar as they are related to the persistence of old and unmet development challenges, as well as to the emergence of some very complex new challenges, the travails that we are witnessing today in some Central American countries may be a harbinger of things to come. Central America, too close to the United States to be ignored, is once again finding its way into the crowded radar of the White House. Thus, more discussion on Central America in the United States, while not necessarily pleasant, is certainly timely. In the next 50 minutes, I'd like to examine 3 sets of issues that remain crucial to the development of Central America, and that unless they are dealt with in a consistent manner and with the help, in some cases, of external actors, will continue to make the region prone to political crisis and democratic reversals. The first issue is the weakness of political power. The second one is the region's uneven and problematic integration into the world economy. The third, and arguably most pressing one, is crime and violence. Before I go into them, let me express a couple of caveats. The first one is that making generalizations about Central America is a risky endeavor because the region is remarkably heterogeneous. To begin with, it shows a clear divide between a more developed South, comprised of Costa Rica and Panama, and a far less developed center and north, i.e. Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala, and to a lesser extent, El Salvador. Just to have an idea, the Human Development Index of Costa Rica and Panama is at roughly the same level as that of Serbia, whereas in terms of human development levels, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and Honduras are at the same level as India. When we think about income per capita, the richest country in the region is more than 4 times as rich as the poorest country. So we have to be careful when we talk about Central America in general. The second caveat is about optimism and pessimism. I'm going to talk about challenges and pending issues, which will perhaps give an overtly somber flavor to my presentation. Yet, if we talk about challenges in Central America, we must never forget where we come from. 3 decades ago, civil wars were raging in 3 countries in the region, and a narco-dictator was ruling another one. As we're about to see, the problems that the region faces are huge, but in some ways, we have come a long way. With those 2 qualifications out of the way, let me talk about 3 crucial democratic and development challenges that I see. The first challenge is of a strictly political nature. It is a problem that Central America shares with much of Latin America, and that I would call, for lack of a better term, the weakness of political power. There are many signs of this weakness, but none is more important or far-reaching in its effects than the fiscal feebleness of the state in Central America. Concerning the tax structure, the situation in Central America, as in much of Latin America, is lamentable. Comparatively speaking, the region has a tax burden that is unacceptably low. At 16%, 1/6 of GDP, the average tax burden in Latin America is well below the Latin American average, and it stands at half the average tax revenue collected by the developed countries of the OECD. The average tax burden in Central America is, in fact, below the tax burden in sub-Saharan Africa. This is bad enough, but what's even worse is the way those taxes are collected. Well over half of the taxes are indirect taxes. That is, taxes that are not sensitive to the wealth of taxpayers. Such fiscal starvation impinges directly on the ability of the state to mitigate the impact of unacceptably high levels of poverty and inequality that afflict these countries. Poverty affects 1/2 of the Central American population. Indeed, in a country like Honduras, nearly 1/2 of the population lives in extreme deprivation, meaning that they don't even have enough to feed themselves. Moreover, this is a region where the richest 10% of the population is between 18 and 54 times richer than the poorest 10%. Yet, in Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, public expenditure on education, healthcare, housing, and social security hovers around or barely above $200 per capita per year. In Uruguay, it is $1,600 per year. In Finland, it is almost $11,000 per year. The fiscal weakness of the Central American states has myriad consequences, but there are a few that I would like to mention here, because they are related to some of the challenges that I will talk about later. A society that is unable to do something about deprivation and inequality almost certainly must contend with very high levels of violence and also with a certain kind of politics, where the populist temptation becomes a permanent danger. Both things bode ill for democratic stability. More fundamentally, fiscally weak states have great problems creating national institutions able to exert effective control over their territory, and therefore are very vulnerable to the ravages of organized crime. Compounding the fiscal weakness of the state, we have in Central America another problem: the lack of bureaucratic capabilities. For the longest time, we in Central America, as elsewhere, have been mired in a very tiresome discussion about the size of the state, but we tend to devote much less attention to its efficacy. And the fact of the matter is that state apparatuses in Central America rank among the least capable in Latin America. And it's actually a useful exercise to take a glance at the World Bank's worldwide, I think it's called, worldwide governance indicators. They make for interesting reading in the case of Central America because, I mean, really the figures are dismal. I mean, much lower than the Latin American figures, which are already a pretty low benchmark. You know, whether we speak about government effectiveness, control of corruption, or the rule of law, the Central American states are below the Latin American average, which, as I said, is already a pretty low benchmark. And it is worth it is worth noting that whenever these rankings are made, Costa Rica appears close to the top of Latin America. And here, I can speak to this, from direct experience. I can tell you that in itself is very telling. For when you're in government in Costa Rica, you constantly ask yourself if collecting more taxes is justified, given the terrible incapacity of the state to spend the money effectively. And this comes from someone that believes passionately in the need of a progressive, tax reform as probably the single most important pending development issue in my own country, in Central America, and in Latin America. And you just wonder, when you're in office, it becomes a nagging question whether it's justified given the terrible lack of capacity, to spend the money wisely. Any stint in the Costa Rican government allows you to see clearly that the problem in many Latin American countries is less the excess of bureaucracy, as commonly claimed by the private sector, but the utter lack of a modern, merit-based bureaucracy. To the syndrome of the feeble state apparatus, we have to add an equally debilitating political disease, an alarming representation deficit, and the resulting obliteration of parties and party systems. If support for democracy is considerably lower in Central America than in Latin America as a whole, 44% of the population in Central America prefers democracy to any other political system, whereas the figure for Latin America as a whole is 56%. Trust in basic democratic institutions such as parties and parliaments is much lower still. More worryingly, democratic attitudes are significantly weaker amongst the young and, to a lesser extent, the poor. According to recent research by Avi Cordova and Mitchell Seligson from Vanderbilt University, the young are less likely to support democracy as a system of government, less likely to believe in the legitimacy of the political system, while more likely to support violent protest and engage in them. The issue of the young is disturbing and pops up in nearly every piece of research done on democratic attitudes in Latin America. A study on political attitudes amongst the Central American youth by Florisabel Rodriguez and Johnny Madrigal, published a few years ago, evinced that abstract support for democracy as a system of government was significantly lower among secondary education students than amongst adults, in some cases by margins of more than 30 points. For the older generation, which lived through a long authoritarian nightmare, democracy was something to strive for. This does not seem to be the case for the young in Central America. They know democracy, and what they see they do not like. They have grown to believe that all politicians are corrupt, that elections change very little, that parties and leaders come and go, and yet glaring inequalities and limited opportunities stay the same, while crime and violence get ever worse. The young in Central America strongly feel that they are not being represented at all by political parties. They suffer from an extremely severe case of political disaffection. In their political hostility, which doesn't bode well for the future of democracy, the young suffer from an especially intense bout of a societal disease. The fact of the matter is that political parties hardly represent anyone in Central America. Some of it has to do with the endemic corruption and with the consistent inability of parties and politicians to turn expectations into realities, partly because the power levers of a feeble state are useless to get anything done. As a result, parties come and go, crushed under the weight of political disaffection. In some countries, we have seen the emergence of something that I would have thought unthinkable: the party-less democracy. Guatemala, for instance, is very much at that stage. But in less dramatic fashion, we have seen the erosion and fragmentation of relatively solid party systems in Panama and Costa Rica. The sum of these political pathologies, a fiscally starved state, institutions with low levels of efficacy, and unrepresentative parties results in weak political authorities embedded in weak political institutions and endowed with weak political power. Even with the best of intentions, democratically elected politicians in Central America exhibit an exceedingly limited ability to nurture development processes, and a growing helplessness vis-a-vis other de facto powers, such as business, media conglomerates, and more worryingly, organized crime. This is neither an speculation nor a strictly Central American problem. 10 years ago, in the course of the research that led to the United Nations report on the democracy in Latin America, more than 230 Latin American leaders were asked the question of who holds power in the region. And they could give several answers. I mean, they didn't have to pick one. I mean, they just, they were asked who holds power in the region. Nearly 80% of them mentioned business conglomerates and the financial sector, while 2/3 mentioned the media. Conversely, the executive branch was mentioned by barely 1/3 of the sample, and the legislative branch by less than 13%. This was a stunning admission of the powerlessness of formal politics in Latin America. Weakness, of course, begets weakness. While it is abundantly clear that measures such as progressive tax reform, civil service modernization, and steps to strengthen party systems, for example, adequate public funding systems, are sorely needed in Central America, it remains unclear who will break the cycle to make the state and its democratic institutions relevant. Relevant, that is, to the purpose of redressing the immense social imbalances that have made Central America's journey towards modernity a treacherous and often tragic one. The second big development challenge concerns Central America's uncertain and uneven integration to the world economy. These are all very open economies, for openness is a must for economies the size of the Central American countries. Foreign trade equals at least 60% of GDP in all countries, and is indeed about 100% of GDP in Honduras, Nicaragua, and Panama. The region has understood that it doesn't have any option but to embrace globalization. These countries were quick on their feet to sign and ratify free trade agreements with the United States. The United States remains a vital economic actor for the region. Bilateral trade in goods between the United States and Central America reached $59 billion in 2013, about the same as between the United States and India, which I find remarkable. Moreover, they have negotiated a comprehensive trade and cooperation agreement with the European Union, and in the case of Costa Rica, also with China. All this, in my view, is positive, indeed necessary. The problem is that for all practical purposes, the easy phase of integrating Central America to the world economy is over. This is not just because a period of easy expansion of world trade is behind us. Perhaps more importantly, the task ahead for Central America is more complicated than simply signing myriad free trade agreements. If these small economies want to be viable, they now have to tackle the truly difficult task of raising the productivity level of their labor force. And the weaknesses they must overcome are very structural. The poorer countries in Central America have followed a model of international insertion largely based on cheap labor, an option that has translated itself into a predominant role for the export of agricultural products and textiles and apparel. For instance, textiles and apparel comprise well over 1/2 of US-bound exports in the case of El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Honduras. At the very least, it is questionable that such a model will be sustainable in the light of the economic emergence of China, India, and even Vietnam. Other countries, particularly Costa Rica and Panama, have better prospects. They have more sophisticated economic structures in which services such as tourism and banking, as well as some kinds of high-tech manufacturing, play a significant role. These countries, however, find themselves in a kind of middle-income trap. They cannot compete by the cheapness of their workforce, but they still have not reached the technological threshold that would allow them to compete by virtue of value added. They are in a sort of economic no man's land. How to increase productivity in Central America calls for a set of very difficult undertakings, including increasing education expenditures that outside Costa Rica and Panama are dismally low. Despite some improvements, almost 3/4 of the Central American workforce still lack complete secondary education, including almost 1/3 that will not have finished even the primary education. It also requires improving road and port infrastructure that outside Panama is among the very worst in Latin America, and bringing research and development investments beyond the pitifully low levels that they have now. And this is a point that I would like to emphasize. At 0.3%, 0.3% of GDP, the resources that Costa Rica invests in research and development are far and away the highest in Central America. Yet, that percentage is less than half the figure for Latin America and the Caribbean as a whole, and 1/15 the figure for Israel. The number of resident patent filings per million inhabitants in Guatemala is roughly on a par with that of Uganda or Zambia. You don't have to be a fortune teller to foresee the difficulties that Guatemala will have to keep pace with the 21st century. Also, the region must lend a hand in myriad ways to small and medium enterprises that are 97% of firms in Central America, which only rarely sell their products abroad. Ultimately, Central America must find a way to drastically reduce the more than 60% of the labor force that currently works in informal jobs with negligible productivity. All this demands enormous public investments of different kinds and a state that works, which of course takes us back to the question of fiscal robustness and in general, stateness. Yet, unless Central America does all that, integration with the world economy will only entrench the traps that Central American countries find themselves in at the moment. Moreover, it will consolidate the terrible social and economic segmentation that we see today in Central America and the region's growing propensity to export its people. For these countries, introducing the structural changes that are needed to enhance productivity, economic dynamism, and opportunities is a tall order. It would be so even if some of them didn't have in remittances an economic shortcut that allows them, if not to thrive, then at least to stay afloat. But they do have that economic shortcut. Today, remittances contribute 10% of GDP in Guatemala, nearly 17% in El Salvador, and over 18% in Honduras, a proportion that hasn't changed much over the past few years. The plain truth is that it is migrants that make the trek north that keep these economies viable. Bar a drastic tightening of migration rules in the United States, this is unlikely to change for the foreseeable future. Sadly, given the difficulties involved in addressing structural economic weaknesses and the lack of obvious sources of sustainable growth, Northern Central America's economic future will most likely hinge on its ability to continue exporting its young people. In the absence of a dramatic change of heart by its political and economic elite, the region will have to give up its best hope for the future in order to have any kind of future. For all the promise that it has for Central America, the fact of the matter is that, as it is today, economic openness is the project of a small, educated minority and not of Central American societies as a whole. The third major development challenge concerns crime and violence. This truly is a tragedy of biblical proportions in Central America. More than 140,000 Central Americans have died in the past 10 years alone as a result of crime, which, come to think of it, is not that different from the figure of the U.S. I mean, about 15,000 people are, victims of homicides in the U.S. every year. So that would make the figure for Central America for the past decade not that different from the figure for the US. Imagine that. This number of deaths is nearly as high as it was at the peak of the civil wars. The murder rate for Central America is 5 times the rate for the world as a whole. Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala have some of the highest rates in the world. Take this in. For each of the past few years, I'm talking here about the past 5-6 years, Honduras alone had far more murders than the 28 member states of the European Union combined. Year in and year out. It's insane. Even Costa Rica and Panama, which up to now had exhibited low murder rates in the context of Latin America, have taken a turn for the worse in the past few years. To have an idea, at 11 homicides per 100,000 people, the murder rate in Costa Rica today is more than twice as high as that of the United States. Murder rates are merely the most visible human consequence of the problem. The proportion of households that have been victims of crime in the course of the past year is greater than 25% in every Central American country. To this, we have to add several other manifestations of violence whose magnitude we can only guess. Different estimates place well above 50,000 the number of members of youth gangs known as maras in Central America. These gangs have a significant incidence in the region's violence levels, as well as a growing participation in supporting organized crime. And this is something that I want to stress. As in the rest of Latin America, violence levels in Central America and their dire social, economic, and political implications cannot be understood but in terms of the pervasive presence of organized crime in the region, particularly drug trafficking, but not exclusively drug trafficking. Close to 90% of the cocaine destined for the U.S. transits through the Central America and Mexico corridor. It is not coincidental that Central America exhibits the highest murder rates in the world. The consequences of this tragedy are multifold and go beyond the obvious human cost. There are economic implications which become clear when we think that more than half the murder casualties in Central America are young men between 15 and 29 years old, at the peak of their productive and reproductive lives. The World Bank's recent estimation of the direct and indirect cost of violence in Central America put it at nearly 8% of the region's GDP. That's a huge dead weight for any region. But it is the political consequences that I want to emphasize here. The perception that state authorities are unable to protect the citizens' most fundamental rights is visibly damaging the support for democratic institutions in Central America and becoming a breeding ground for authoritarian attitudes, which are never far from the surface anyway. According to a 2008 study by Jose Miguel Cruz, a scholar at Florida International University, 53% of the population in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras was willing to support a coup d'etat if it helped to solve insecurity problems, a reaction that no other social problem elicited. The Central American population, as frightened as it is eager for public order, is heeding carefully and often rewarding at the ballot box populist rhetoric that offers the iron fist and a cavalier attitude towards the rule of law to solve the problem. This is unfortunate, for the record of iron fist solutions to crime is poor. Both Honduras and El Salvador offer a poignant reminder of this. In Honduras, the enactment since 2002 of successive legislative packages to deal with crime with clear repressive overtones has only made the situation worse. The 56 murders per 100,000 people that the country had in 2002 have climbed to nearly 90 today, the worst figure in the world. The Salvadoran experience is more complex, but equally unfortunate. In that country, the introduction of the Iron Fist and Super Iron Fist Acts in 2003 and 2004 was enabled to prevent the massive escalation of violence that preceded the adoption of a semi-official truce between the main youth gangs in 2012. The collapse of that truce in 2014 has seen the return, with a vengeance, of three ills that seem to march apace: a virtual state of war between the gangs, widespread fear in society, and a heavy-handed response from the government, which appears at a loss as to how to stop the vicious cycle of killing. August of 2015 ended with more than 900 homicides, making it the deadliest month since the end of the Civil War in El Salvador. In all likelihood, the return of the iron fist, and more worryingly, of the militarization of public security, will not be more successful than previous iterations of the policy. A second crucial political consequence of crime and fear of it is the weakening of the state and its legal powers. As is the case in certain regions of Mexico, in some places in northern Central America that have been overrun by organized crime, it is debatable whether the state still enjoys the monopoly over legitimate coercion. The consequences of the weakening of the state's writ are several. One of them is the growing tendency amongst the citizenry in these countries to defect from the public instruments to protect security, whose activation is considered useless and even counterproductive. This defection can take different shapes that range from the reluctance of the population to report crime to the proliferation of private security firms, scantily regulated, and the acceptance of lynching as a valid method to fight crime. It should be enough to say that in a country such as Costa Rica, with a judicial system that ranks amongst the best in Latin America, less than 1/4 of crimes are reported to the authorities, and nearly 40% of the population looks favorably at the option of lynching offenders. Last but not least, many citizens in Central America are defecting by leaving their country. For all the tough talk about iron-fisted solutions, a sustainable reduction of crime levels in the Central American context requires far more than the use of coercion. It demands a comprehensive policy combination that gives priority to reforming notoriously corrupt and inefficient police forces, introducing modern technology and information systems to sustain policy decisions, strengthening social ties and the organization of communities, and above all, investing a lot more in education, health, housing, and opportunities for the youth. Such is the road traveled by successful experiences in Latin American cities like Bogotá and Sao Paulo, which have managed to slash violence levels dramatically in the past 2 decades. With 80 murders per 100,000 people, Bogotá was one of the world's most dangerous cities in 1994. 80 murders per 100,000 people. In 2014, with 17, it was one of the safest capitals in the Western Hemisphere. It was actually much safer than Washington, D.C. Balancing zero tolerance for crime with zero tolerance for social exclusion offers a way forward even in dire circumstances. Drug trafficking deserves a final mention. Dealing with this phenomenon, which is at the heart of the security discussion in the whole of Latin America, demands a multidimensional response in which, of course, the use of intelligence and state coercion are inescapable. To that, we have to add efforts to prevent consumption and provide adequate treatment to addicts. Above all, we have to add a vigorous diplomatic dimension aimed at showing that this is a problem that far exceeds national boundaries and hence demands a true hemisphere-wide dialogue between drug-producing, drug-consuming, money laundering, and transshipment countries. Such a diplomatic effort must encourage a profound revision of counter-narcotics policies in the United States. It has become increasingly obvious that the so-called war on drugs has been a very costly failure, which has generated all sorts of deleterious implications for the rest of the hemisphere and for the U.S., I must add. A serious international dialogue on counter-narcotics efforts in the hemisphere is essential to improve the security situation in Central America and to reduce the grave risks that the region's democratic systems are currently facing. Fortunately, in the past few years, we have witnessed the first stirrings of that crucial debate. The turning point probably was the 6th Summit of the Americas held in Cartagena, Colombia, in April 2012, which allowed an unprecedented, honest exchange on the state of counter-narcotic policies among the hemisphere's political leaders. For the first time, it was neither academics, nor civil society leaders, nor retired politicians, but active decision makers at the highest level that publicly made the same statements that, in many cases, they had made privately for a long time. And the truth is that we have seen many changes since. I mean, we've seen the legalization of marijuana in Uruguay. Legalization of marijuana is being discussed currently as we speak in Canada. We've seen legalization of marijuana adopted in 4 states in the U.S. So, I mean, this discussion is gaining strength and pace. It is impossible to know, as yet, where this discussion will lead or whether it will be conducted with an open mind and a true empirical vocation. We can only hope so. What is undeniable is that Latin American political leaders finally have begun to eradicate the prohibition to think that for decades marred anti-drug policies in the region. That is the start of a solution. What is the moral of this tale? I'm not sure there's only one lesson, but if I were to pick only one, I would say that democracy becomes a perilous journey in the absence of a state that works. Central America's current political troubles suggest that democracy is doomed to live on the edge if the presumed instruments of self-government, i.e., a set of public institutions that ultimately respond to the people, are starved to death, deprived of muscle and brains, largely incapable of solving concrete problems for real people. Democracy lives dangerously when those institutions are chronically weak, as they are in most of Central America, to redress social imbalances that render impossible the existence of a democratic polis. Largely unable to provide the public goods upon which sustained economic growth and human development ultimately depend. Increasingly incapable to protect the basic core of fundamental rights, including life, physical integrity, enjoyment of private property, and freedom from fear that keep any social contract together. We thus go back to an old insight of the late Samuel Huntington. Paying attention to the degree of government that some Central American countries enjoy today is at least as important as paying attention to the form of government that they have. And let me be clear about what I mean here. This does not mean that the democratic institutions that Central American countries have built are irrelevant, or that we ought to be agnostic about the methods, whether democratic or authoritarian, employed to build effective state institutions. Far from it. Democracy is always relevant precisely because the effectiveness of the state that really matters lies in its ability to contribute to human development, a project that only has meaning with democracy at its core. In the absence of a state that works, democracy is not worthless. It is simply less effective and more prone to breakdowns. Over the past 2 decades, Central America has done the most important things, but that's not to say that they are the most difficult things. Ending the civil wars and building democratic institutions are tremendous achievements, essential for human development. But they are far less difficult than the tasks that are pending. I guess it is the same as with any of us. Being born is the most important step of our lives, but it's far easier when compared with the 20 or 40 or 80 years that follow. It is what we do day in and day out over a prolonged period that defines if our birth will unleash the wonderful potential for human nature or will end up engrossing the populated graveyard of wasted opportunities. The end of the wars and the democratic transitions in Central America threw a lifeline to the region, but today that lifeline is at risk of being wasted. As in the rest of Latin America, carrying out the structural reforms needed in Central America, particularly tax reform, has been extraordinarily difficult. But those that truly care about human development and democracy in the region must keep trying with an increased sense of urgency. No matter how prosperous today, if the isthmus social and political elites bury their heads in the face of the challenges identified above, the weakness of the state, the collapse of political representation, the stagnation of productivity, and the deterioration of public security, they will make inevitable Central America's return to an age of political unrest in which everyone, rich and poor alike, will certainly lose. Everyone will lose out, with the possible exception of organized crime syndicates equipped to thrive in turmoil. Given what Central America has gone through in the past and the real strides it has made in the past 2 decades, this would be a very sad turn of events. Now, a final reflection about the United States. Over the past 150 years, the United States has done many things to hinder human development and democracy in Central America. The list of unfortunate interventions by Washington is long, probably longer than anywhere else in the world, and it's pointless to repeat it here. Set against such a background, the neglect of the past 20 years is welcome news up to a point. Because the truth is that some of the problems described here go well beyond what Central America alone can solve. While it is essential to emphasize that the primary responsibility to turn Central America around lies with the Central Americans themselves, it is also clear that the United States could and should assist the region. Luckily, the importance of doing so is finally dawning on Washington, D.C. The Alliance for Prosperity for the Northern Triangle, whose funding was recently authorized by the U.S. Congress, is a valuable and well-conceived program that is worthy of support. Above all, it is a sign that the United States cares about its neighbors and is actively trying to shape the future of a relationship that is doomed to be part of U.S. policy debates, as has happened time and again over the past century and a half. The Alliance's strategic lines, namely stimulating the productive sector, developing opportunities for people, improving public safety and justice, and strengthening institutions, embody the long-term and integral approach that is essential in order to bring about structural change in Northern Central America, and hopefully contain migration flows to the United States. It will be a significant loss, not just to Central America, but also to U.S. taxpayers, if a result of bureaucratic and political tussles in Washington, the program sheds its holistic conception and winds up as yet another narrow counter-narcotics effort. Development problems in the Northern Triangle are complex and mutually reinforcing. It is highly unlikely that any effort designed to tackle any one of them will have any impact if it fails to set in motion changes in other policy areas. The alliance is only the beginning. Much more could be done by the United States, ranging from supporting and expanding the work of the UN-sponsored International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, to helping Central America's small and medium enterprises take advantage of free trade with the U.S., to promoting the development of renewable energies in Central America, one of the few industries in which the isthmus has considerable long-term comparative advantages. Above all, the United States could do a lot to profoundly rethink counter-narcotics policies. The terrifying cost that Central America is bearing in terms of drug-related violence, drug-related corruption, and the permanent damage inflicted on the work ethics of an entire generation can and should be mitigated by decisions made in Washington. For Washington, paying more attention to Central America, if not intense attention, then at least steady attention, would not be a favor or an act of charity. In the case of a region that is showing disturbing signs of political instability, that is a stone's throw away from the United States, and that has already sent 3 million of its people to the shores of this country, it could only be considered enlightened self-interest. Thank you. Feel free to ask any question. Okay, one here and one there.
Start with that.
Okay. You go first.
Thanks for your, I guess.
My pleasure.
information. I came a little slightly late, so are you attempting to put aside the baggage of American interventionism within the region and focus more on the internal components currently? So you waited to like the very last moment to speak of the amount of interventionism that actually is taking place that has led to some of the reality that we see today. So are you focusing on looking just strictly internally of how Latin America, and I would actually even add the Caribbean into this dynamic for, you know, the way forward?
Well, thank you for your question. Thank you for being here. Generally speaking, you're right. You're right. I'm squarely putting the emphasis on the internal reasons for Central America being what it is today. And to tell you the truth, that's where I think the emphasis should be. I didn't have time or space here to develop one of the points that I developed in my Senate testimony, which is that, take the problem of organized crime, which is undoubtedly one of the key issues in Central America. I mean, the reason why these countries are so vulnerable to organized crime is not just because of geography. It's not just because they just happen to be, sandwiched between the big drug-producing countries of the South and the big drug-consuming countries of the North. It's much more complicated than that. I mean, they're vulnerable to organized crime because their law enforcement institutions are in a shambles. They are vulnerable to organized crime because something between 25 and 30% of their young people are neither studying nor working. And that's not something that any amount of external help will be able to solve. The solution to that has to come from within. I mean, and the reason why these countries have such fiscally starved states is not because of some conspiracy, in Washington, D.C. It's because the political elites have been unable and unwilling to tackle that issue, without which there's no future for these countries. So, I mean, just to finish the idea. So, at some point, we have to say that yes, it is true that the U.S. bears responsibility and that the U.S. is in a position to help this country and should help this country. And that responsibility is particularly clear when it comes to the war on drugs, I would say. But ultimately, Central Americans have to take responsibility for their fate. And it's really, I mean, just as it was almost 30 years ago, when it was the Central Americans that finally decided to put an end to the civil wars, the same applies today. It's Central Americans themselves that have to take charge of their destiny and solve all these very structural issues. The U.S. can help, but it's not incumbent on the U.S. to do that.
But in the case of many Caribbean countries, right, if you open your societies to, the neoliberal project, and you open yourselves to corporations that essentially create Bantustans in your own country through, partnership agreements, and you have oligarchs who are literally willing to not cooperate when it comes to, paying taxation. So I do understand the point of, Trinidad, Jamaica, we have massive corruption, so you're paying taxes to a system that doesn't result in anything. But how do you fight against the economic oligarchs in your own society while the corporations who you invite in to attempt to have any semblance of, economic development at all, also themselves want to have a relationship where essentially, they come to your country on their terms. So I'm trying to figure out how like essentially, if we close ourselves, we starve because we don't have the economic ability to, you know, survive outside of the global community. And if we open up, we also have the same reality that you speak of. So,
I mean, I have to start by saying that I'm no specialist on the Caribbean, so I claim no expertise, you know, to speak. So, I mean, I mean, this might be the politician's answer, but anyway, I mean, but I do know about Central America, and you know, the discussion that you allude to is a very important one, and two things. I mean, first of all, whether you take advantage. Whether you're in a position to take advantage, I mean, the effect of economic openness depends on who you are. You know, for a country like Costa Rica that has done a lot of the difficult things, that got a lot of the difficult things right, that has a reasonably well-educated population, that has a very healthy population, that has a lot, has institutions that work. Economic openness can only be good, in my book. I can see that in some other countries that are more vulnerable, that compete by virtue of their cheap labor force, it can be a problem. I can see that. But I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example of how this interaction between foreign corporations and development in the country can be virtuous. The example of Intel in Costa Rica. Intel set shop in Costa Rica in '97, and a huge plant of computer chips was built outside San Jose. And that was a massive thing for the country. And last year, Intel decided to leave the country. I mean, the manufacturing part of Intel's plant was transferred to, I think, to Vietnam. There's still some, research and development facilities and so on, but why did that happen? Well, it happened because in 1997, when Intel arrived in the country, it politely asked, and I bear witness to the fact that it was politely asked the country to solve the fiscal problem. Because otherwise, the country would not be in a position to invest in infrastructure that was needed by, not just by Intel, but by the country itself. It politely asked to do something about the shortage of engineers in the country, which was of obvious relevance to Intel. It politely asked the country, as I mentioned, to improve the quality of basic infrastructure, which was a shambles back in '97, right? Well, 18 years later, the country has not solved its fiscal problem. The quality of the infrastructure has not gone up. The number of engineers has not gone up. Intel packed up and left. Whose fault is that? So, this is a clear case example of something that could have been a very virtuous interaction between a foreign corporation, a multinational, and local institutions. And it was squarely local institutions that did not get the job done. So, all I'm trying to say is that it's more complicated. I honestly don't think, I admit that there's an interesting discussion to be had about this, and the discussion can, yield different results in different countries. But, I'm by no means persuaded that economic openness is necessarily a bad thing for Central American countries as a whole. Over there.
A couple of questions, but probably the easiest one for you to respond to is there any role for microfinance as a way to nurture that portion of your population that still has a desire to improve itself in small ways that would be locally advantageous? It doesn't require an Intel.
Sure.
It's a village by village sort of thing, which we've seen some. It has its own challenges, but at least it's small, dealing with a small country with small people and localize it. It seemed like it could be too small for the gangs to even think about.
The obvious answer would be yes. I mean, there's a lot to be done through that kind of instrument, microfinance. Yeah, there is. I'm not intimately familiar with that, but there is. I mean, just as there is in Mexico and in other places, in Colombia, in other places in Latin America. But I think, the more fundamental question, which is one that I, frankly struggle with is, in some of the countries where microfinance would be useful, would truly make a difference. Say in the Northern Triangle, yes, you can improve the lot of, people one by one. But on a more, aggregate scale, what are the sources of economic accumulation for these countries? What are the long-term prospects, economic prospects for some of these countries? And for the life of me, I don't see any. For countries like Guatemala, like Honduras, El Salvador might be slightly different, but not much. You cannot help but to think that the only obvious source of economic dynamism is remittances. Is exporting their people. Really, I mean, when you see, what's the future of, say, the textile industry in these countries, which is a very important component in all three of them, in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. What's the future of that industry? When you have the Vietnams and the Indias of this world taking over that industry. So you really have to wonder, it's a fairly disturbing kind of question. What's the potential source of economic viability for some of these countries? I don't have a clear answer to that. I have a very clear answer for Costa Rica and Panama. And that you can see, But for the other countries, it's not obvious. So yes, you can improve the lot of a lot of people through instruments like microfinance and so on. It's wonderful. But on a more aggregate level, how to improve the lot of the country is not obvious to me. Dan.
I know next to nothing about the region, but I have a two-part question for you. One is, if you had willing or interested governments in the region, would something along the lines of Plan Colombia be a useful endeavor, and could Washington incentivize elites in the region by dangling that idea? The second is that although I think your criticism of counter-narcotics programs is well placed, the U.S. has spent billions in recent decades on broader efforts to train police, and I'm curious what your assessment of that effort has been, because I will tell you that from the policymaker's perspective, it's a source of endless frustration.
Right. The Alliance for Prosperity in the Northern Triangle is is something vaguely similar to Plan Colombia on a much smaller scale, probably with a more holistic approach, and I think it's a good thing that it's like that. And with a crucial difference, which is one question on which the jury is still out, which is that whichever program you set in motion in Central America entails a very significant coordination issue that you didn't really have in the case of Colombia. I mean, but in the case of the Alliance for Prosperity or the previous iterations of different security programs set in motion by the U.S. in the region, I mean, you had to deal with 3, 4, 6, 7 different countries, and that became a nightmare. So the implementation of all these programs is very ostensibly hindered by the coordination problem. I mean, I'll give you, a very simple example. I mean, and something that I've seen in practice, if you're, an intelligence guy in Costa Rica that, manages for whatever means to collect intelligence on crime syndicates, I'm sure you would think twice about sharing your intelligence with your Guatemalan counterparts that almost for a fact that are in the pocket of the crime syndicates that you're fighting against. So why on earth are you going to share your intelligence? I mean, and that sort of thing is endemic. So in principle, the answer is yes, something similar to Plan Colombia could potentially work. Mind you, it could work if it entails a very strong component of conditionality. I mean, if it demands that these countries carry out and get serious about the structural reforms that they have to be serious about. And to me, the seriousness of the U.S. partners in the region has to be measured in 2 ways. Number one, their willingness to enact a serious progressive tax reform. Number one. I mean, it is, quite frankly, it is crazy to ask U.S., the long-suffering U.S. taxpayer to pay for public goods that this country should be providing, and that the elites in these countries are not providing because they don't pay any taxes, right? So tax reform. And the second thing is their willingness to be serious about checks and balances and judicial independence, which is essential to fight corruption. If they show that they are serious about those 2 things, then we might get places, then we might see some progress. So, that would be my caveat, something similar to Plan Colombia, but with strong conditionality. Number one. And your second question about the police reform. In Central America, the U.S. has not done a lot of that, to the extent that, interestingly, it is other countries in Latin America that are doing a lot, in terms of helping the Central Americans improve the capabilities of their police forces, their capabilities to carry out complex financial investigations on money laundering. It's the Colombians, the Chileans. Particularly the Colombians are all over the place in Central America, training people, training prosecutors, training police units, much more than the U.S. I mean, in a way, and I think it's a good thing. The U.S. I mean, if you're going to do something on law enforcement in Central America, I think it's pretty inevitable that you have to enlist both Colombia and Mexico, which are very significant actors in the region. And to some extent, the U.S. has outsourced that to the Colombians, which I
The Colombians law and training.
what is that?
I mean, it is in some ways a follow-on effect of playing Colombia.
Exactly. Which is not a bad idea, but it's something that is happening in the region. John.
I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala as a potential model. I mean, this seems to be, you mentioned it, reports I read about it seem to sway between absolute euphoria, as this is the model that needs to be emulated elsewhere, and complete disdain. And I'm wondering if you can talk about what the current assessment of it is. People talk about an analogous setup for Honduras.
Yeah.
Is that a viable model?
I think it is a viable model. I mean, my assessment is decidedly positive. It's not perfect and it's not without its flaws, but I think the overall balance after, I think, 8 years that it's been around, 9 years, is definitely positive. I mean, I didn't mention in my presentation, perhaps I was unfair, and it was part of that negative bias of my presentation. I didn't mention what happened in Guatemala a few months ago. I mean, that they managed to prosecute for, on corruption charges, the sitting president, which is quite extraordinary by any standard. I mean, anywhere in the world, but particularly in Guatemala. I mean, they managed to, they forced the president to resign, and they prosecuted him on corruption charges. And that was possible because the CICIG was, the CICIG is CICIG is the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, which is a UN-sponsored body created 9 years ago by the UN and the government of Guatemala, which was created to investigate and prosecute in inverted commas. I'm going to get into that. To investigate and prosecute complex, organized crime-related cases, right? In practice, what happened was that CICIG has been a vetted unit in a system that has been thoroughly penetrated by organized crime. And that's the state of law enforcement institutions in Guatemala. I mean, the corruption problems and the problem of capture by organized crime is endemic. I mean, CICIG became this parallel set of investigators and prosecutors that would investigate these cases, and at some point they would have to take the case to the local judiciary. But when it was, tied in with a ribbon, basically, and even so, in many cases, the local judiciary, the local judiciary harmed, some of the cases that the CICIG had put together. I think the effect of CICIG has been very, very, very positive. Of course, you can very easily make the point, but what's left for the country in terms of institution building? And that's a legitimate question. And probably the flaw of CICIG is that it has not done enough to transfer the knowledge and the expertise enough to the local judiciary and to the local law enforcement institutions. But without CICIG, I have no doubt whatsoever that those cases that CICIG has been able to investigate, bring to the light, and bring to prosecution and bring to justice would have never happened. in Guatemala. Is it a potentially expandable model? I think it is. I think to me, it's eminently clear that there's a, and I've talked to some of the folks for years now, I mean, to some of the folks at the State Department, that's a worthy project, you know, trying to create a regional CICIG for, at least for the Northern Triangle, because, I mean, all these countries have more or less the same kind of problem. And not just that, it would also, I mean, a regional CICIG would also be a way, would also provide an instrument to coordinate the use of the foreign assistance that Central America is getting for security issues. The region is receiving a lot of money to fight organized crime in terms of international assistance. But there's no coordination mechanism. A regional CICIG could have that function. So I think it's very clear that it's a model that you can scale up very, very soon.
Political will in the Northern Triangle countries outside of.
No, that's the problem. That's the problem. I mean, the other after what's happened in Guatemala, I mean, political elites in Honduras and El Salvador are loath to see something like CICIG taking root in their countries. So that can only be external pressure, pretty much, or internal pressure as well. I mean, if people there's a very active civil society, at least in Honduras, there is demanding precisely that something very similar to CICIG is created in Honduras. We'll see who wins. Over there, and then over there.
So you talked a lot about having a progressive tax system.
Yeah.
I was wondering, is the government at all worried that if the system actually is implemented, would there be a lot of capital flight from the rich? Because it seems like this country where a lot of the wealth and power is concentrated on top, and that you also mentioned that this huge migration that's happening as well as emerging countries. So, like, to what extent do you think that I don't know, sort of raising tax rates on the rich will lead to this mass sort of capital flight?
Well, there is a lot of capital flight anyway, you know, without the tax reform. I mean, you know, what is, the heart of the issue here is whether the states will be able to provide public goods and services. Mind you, public goods and services that are, a lot of our rights, our basic rights, translate themselves into public goods and services. You know, public education and housing and, you know. So what's the point here is whether these countries will be in a position to provide public goods and services. I mean, currently they are not. And that's of obvious relevance, one would think, for business. I mean, these countries have some of the worst basic infrastructure in Latin America, outside of Panama. Panama is a different case. You know, in some of these countries, taking a container from the capital city to the port takes as long as, or is as difficult and as traumatic as taking that product from the Guatemalan port to Shanghai. So, basic infrastructure would be, a very important thing for the private sector. Not to speak of the fact that if you invest, and I think that this is something that my own country did, not just reasonably well, but from an early date. If you invest in public education, you're bound to be more successful in terms of producing higher value added goods. So I mean, this is not. I mean, the ability of a state to provide public goods and services is not just simply a matter of charity. I mean, it is that those public goods and services are essential for capitalist accumulation. If you don't have, a decently educated labor force, if you don't have basic infrastructure worthy of the name, if you don't have a certain level of research and development, I mean, it's very difficult to be economically successful. So, whether the private sector in Central America will be able to realize that or not, well, they haven't so far. They haven't. It's a tough sell. And there's this anecdote, that talking about Plan Colombia, that, one of the key elements of Plan Colombia was that President Uribe, when Plan Colombia started to be implemented in Colombia, President Uribe basically told the elite, look, we need to invest more on security. And I'm going to raise your taxes because otherwise we will not be able to provide the security that this country needs. I mean, Colombia at that time was almost on the verge of becoming a failed state, right? And the elites that were staring at the abyss played along, and accepted that they had to pay more taxes, right? And a lot of the investment actually Plan Colombia was a very small component of the overall investment on security pursuits that the Colombian state did over the course of 10 or 12 years. I mean, the bulk of it was actually Colombian money, right? And there's this story of, President Uribe, after leaving office, he went to Guatemala. And, he was invited to give this lecture, like this, and there was this auditorium, full to the brim, of wealthy people admiring President Uribe and cheering President Uribe until he said that, well, guys, that, the way we did this in Colombia was we raised taxes on the wealthy. Silence in the auditorium. Silence. So that tells you, how hard a sell this is in countries like those in Central America. But there's a price to be paid. I mean, I wish, I wish elites in Guatemala realized that there are two ways to pay for your security. Either you pay taxes or you pay more in armored cars. You're going to pay for your security one way or the other. Right? So you might as well, be willing to support the provision of public goods in a more generous way. But that's me. And I'm not part of the wealthy elite, believe me. Over there, and then I'll go to the back.
My daughter last year finished 2 years in the Peace Corps in Panama. I'm familiar with that country, and you quite rightfully divide the countries into two groups. In Panama, they still have had problems. There's a recent article in The Economist talks about money laundering.
Yeah.
You identified some of the problems in Costa Rica. What have been the factors that have enabled those countries, despite their problems, to reach a different level? And can what they've done serve as a model for the other countries that haven't done as well?
That's a phenomenal question. I know the story of Costa Rica. I know less about the story of Panama, though I mean, in the case of Costa Rica, it's very clear that the country made a very conscious decision early on to invest a lot in education and health and in human development. And to create institutions that were reasonably stable. And I guess, that sort of thing is self-reinforcing. I mean, once you create stable institutions, they become more stable, And over time, I mean, the fact that the country had invested in human development allowed it to be more economically successful for the reasons that I just laid out. I mean, the kind of industries that set shop in Costa Rica is totally different from the kind of industry that set shop in Honduras. And there's a reason for that. It is, that over a very long period, Costa Rica made a set of investments in its people that brought it to a different place. In the case of Panama, it's less clear because, the success of Panama is a more recent thing. It's a more recent thing. I mean, Panama is, well, there's the obvious reason that it's sitting atop this huge asset, which is the canal, which is it's like printing money. I mean, you have a money maker there, and mind you, to their credit, and this is very important, when the canal was transferred to Panamanian hands in '99, there were fears that they would wreck the place. They would turn the asset into shambles. They did not. I mean, they run the canal admirably well. Well, to the extent that they are, they just expanded it, and not just that. I mean, it's a very professionally run operation. I mean, and I think that has had a massive economic impact. And there's also, this has a shady element to it, but Panama has also been very successful in leveraging certain sectors like the banking sector, insurance, things like those. It became a service economy much earlier than any other country probably in Latin America. And I say that this has a shady element to it because, we know that, Panama is a tax haven and it's been given a hard time because of that. Whether that's going to dent their ability to compete in those sectors in the future, I don't know. But so far, they've been able to leverage those sectors in a very effective way, to create wealth. Mind you, Panama has a massive distribution problem. Income inequality in Panama is horrendous. It's horrendous. You have to account for that. But in any case, over the past 2 decades, I would say it's been exceptionally dynamic from the economic standpoint. It's been by some margin the fastest economy in Latin America, not just Central America, in Latin America by some margin. Is this replicable in other countries? Well, not in the short run, but in the long run, yes. If you invest enough in your people, you're bound to open up opportunities that would not be available to you otherwise. And that's why the whole question of the tax system is so important, because you want to be able to invest in public education and healthcare and the things that really matter, opportunities for the young people, unless you have the ability to provide public goods and services of good quality. And
you won't be able to do that unless you increase tax revenue. There's no other way.
Or perhaps if you just build another canal. But
Yeah,
that would be a topic for another seminar. Let me ask you all to join me in thanking.
Thank you. Thank you so much.